The cell was silent except for the soft hum of fluorescent light. Dawn had not yet broken over the gray walls of the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center when a guard, making his rounds, stopped at a door that should have contained restless sleep. Instead, the stillness inside Aaron Hernandez's cell had the brittle quality of something already broken. The sheets, torn and knotted, swayed faintly like a pendulum. A Bible lay open near the cot, its thin pages crumpled as though someone had pressed them too tightly in his last hours. On the wall, faint impressions scratched into the surface with a crude tool seemed to spell names only he could understand. Aaron Hernandez was 27 years old. The world outside knew him as a fallen star, a former New England Patriots tight end, once hailed as one of the NFL's brightest talents. But here, in the pale silence of the prison, the narrative had collapsed into a single scene. A young man, larger than life in stadiums of screaming fans, had ended his story with a gesture of finality, suspended by his own hand. Yet as the officials filed into the cell, their flashlights cutting through shadows, the contradictions grew more troubling than the death itself. Why now? Just days earlier, Hernandez had won a legal victory. One murder conviction overturned. A second trial concluded with acquittal. To many, it looked as if he had found a narrow path toward hope. His lawyers had spoken of appeals, of a possible future where he might breathe free air again. But now he dangled lifeless in his cell, a Bible beside him as though offering both explanation and refusal. The guards moved with a ritualistic efficiency, photographing the scene, documenting the sheets, noting the time on the institutional clock above the corridor. But clocks do not reveal motive. They only bear witness to the hour at which questions multiply. In the days that followed, those questions spread like cracks in a mirror. Was this truly suicide, the final act of a man unable to reconcile guilt and lost glory? Or was there something else? A hidden hand, a silent threat, a secret Hernandez carried that proved too heavy to bear. The notes he left behind offered no clear answers, only fragments. Words to his fiancée, his daughter, a reference to a biblical passage about resurrection. To some, it read like farewell. To others, like code. Inside the prison walls, whispers of threats and conflicts floated through the air. Rumors of debts, of loyalty owed and broken, of a man with one foot still in the world he had tried to leave behind. Outside, the headlines dripped with sensationalism. NFL star dead at 27, from Super Bowl to suicide. But headlines are only shadows. The truth hides behind the noise. What is certain is the stark image. The sheets swaying gently in the fluorescent hum, the Bible waiting with unturned pages, and the unyielding door closing once more on an empty cell. A door that had opened for guards that morning will remain closed forever, holding secrets no appeal could ever reach. And so begins the unraveling of Aaron Hernandez, not the athlete on television screens, but the man who carried too many lives within one body. In the silence of his prison death, we find a story not of endings but of echoes. Echoes that refuse to fade. Friday night, lights had always seemed to follow him. In Bristol, Connecticut, the stadium glow stretched across neighborhoods of weathered houses and quiet streets, drawing entire families into bleachers that groaned under their weight. In the center of it all was a boy who ran as though chased by something invisible. Aaron Hernandez was not yet the man the world would know, but already he moved like someone running toward destiny or away from a shadow at his back. He was 16 when tragedy first reshaped his world. His father, Dennis Hernandez, a towering figure of discipline and order, collapsed during routine hernia surgery and never rose again. For Aaron, the suddenness of the loss was like a thunderclap in winter, unexpected, raw, and final. In his eyes, his father had been unbreakable. The absence left behind was more than silence in the household. It was a fracture. Teachers saw his grades slip. Friends noticed his restlessness sharpen. The boy who once lived by his father's strict code began testing boundaries that no longer felt guarded. On the field, though, he was untouchable. Tall, fast, unyielding, Aaron transformed pain into performance. Recruiters circled like moths to flame. The University of Florida called, then the NFL. Each touchdown was a flashbulb, each victory a curtain rising on the promise of greatness. Yet, even under those lights, the darker threads were visible if you looked closely. Bristol was not only home to quiet suburban streets, it was a town with rougher corners, where drugs and violence seeped into young lives like water through cracked foundations. Aaron carried those corners with him, long after he stepped into locker rooms polished to gleam under television cameras. Friends from his youth remained in his orbit, men with records, men who knew another side of survival. In Gainesville at Florida, whispers began, late-night fights, bar altercations, brushes with police. Coaches shielded him, teammates closed ranks. To the public, he was a prodigy catching impossible passes, a hero sculpted in stadium smoke. Behind the curtain, contradictions deepened, discipline entwined with chaos, ambition undercut by old loyalties. There was an intensity to him, as if the game itself was not enough to quiet something internal. Coaches described him as explosive, not only in talent but in temperament. Anger flared like sparks, striking dry wood. But every Sunday, he appeared under the stadium lights, and the noise of adoration drowned the unease. When the New England Patriots signed him, the story seemed destined for triumph. A hometown boy, just 2 hours from Bristol, now standing on the field of one of football's greatest dynasties. The crowds at Gillette Stadium roared his name as Tom Brady hurled him passes that turned into points, victories, even a Super Bowl appearance. But shadows travel fast. In the stands, his fiancée and infant daughter watched him carve touchdowns into legend, while outside the stadium, rumors swirled. Nightclubs, confrontations, a life lived in parallel tracks, one gilded with wealth, another haunted by the streets he could never leave behind. The Friday night lights of Bristol had expanded into the blinding glare of national television. But as the glow intensified, so too did the darkness around him. It was as if each roar of the crowd pushed him further toward a precipice unseen by the fans who worshipped him. And in that paradox, beloved prodigy, haunted son lay the seed of everything that would follow. The touchdowns came like clockwork. Each Sunday, Aaron Hernandez moved with a precision that seemed to erase every doubt, hands stretching to snatch spirals from the air, feet gliding just inside the boundary line, muscles coiled in a perfect symphony of speed and power. The roar of the crowd at Gillette Stadium drowned out the unease beneath. To most fans, he was a miracle in motion, a weapon perfectly engineered for the Patriots' machine. Yet behind that grace lay whispers too sharp to ignore. Teammates noticed the sudden changes in his moods, eruptions of temper that arrived without warning. Coaches saw the lateness to meetings, the quick glances at a buzzing phone that tied him to friends still circling from the edges of Bristol. There were reports quiet, often buried, of altercations at bars, accusations that evaporated under settlements or silence. The polished stadium glass reflected only half of Aaron's life. Beyond it, another reflection stared back. A young man, unable to cut ties with old alliances. The same hands that pulled down million-dollar contracts also texted men with records, men who carried guns. In photographs, Aaron often looked like two different people, the smiling athlete in a crisp suit and the brooding figure in dimly lit clubs, surrounded by shadows of loyalty and threat. In 2011, an incident in Boston cut through the surface. A man shot in the face after leaving a nightclub reportedly pointed to Hernandez as the one who pulled the trigger. The claim vanished into legal fog, dismissed, ignored, and eventually sealed behind settlements. Still, rumors spread like cracks in glass. They spoke of a man who could turn violent in an instant, whose anger flickered like a fuse too short. At his mansion in North Attleboro, the contradictions grew sharper. Inside the walls, his fiancée and daughter lived a life gilded with luxury cars, jewelry, contracts worth millions. Yet in the basement, investigators would later find a hidden room stocked with weapons, a sanctuary of another kind. It was as if the house itself contained two lives, like a mirror that refused to show only one reflection. And yet, on the field, none of it mattered. Each touchdown erased doubt, at least for a moment. Tom Brady found him in the end zone. Fans lifted his name into the cold New England air, and Aaron Hernandez became the symbol of a dynasty's next chapter. He smiled in victory photos, pointed skyward after touchdowns, played the role of young father cradling his child. But silence gathered in the margins. Nightclubs turned into crime scenes. Friends disappeared from his orbit, some fearing him, others depending on him. Tattoos bloomed across his skin symbols, codes, cryptic marks that spoke of a life carried in fragments. Each inked line seemed like an unspoken confession, one never meant for public ears. The duality was undeniable. A man capable of breathtaking athletic grace, and one whose rage lingered just beneath the surface. Teammates avoided asking too many questions. Coaches praised his talent while tightening the leash. Yet no leash could restrain the pull of the streets he had never truly left. Every touchdown began to feel like a countdown. Each spike of the ball against the turf was a drumbeat marching toward something inevitable. The shadows were gathering, and the cheers of the stadium could no longer drown them out. And so, in the tension between glory and ruin, Aaron Hernandez lived each game a dazzling illusion, each night a reminder that the past was never silent. It was past midnight when gunfire echoed through an industrial park in North Attleboro, Massachusetts. The air was heavy with summer humidity, and the silence that followed was sharper than the crack of the shots themselves. A body lay on the gravel. Odin Lloyd, semi-professional football player, friend, and in the final hours of his life, companion to Aaron Hernandez. His last steps, traced backward, pointed directly toward the mansion that stood like a fortress on the hill. The night had begun in the casual rhythm of friendship, drinks, laughter, the blurred edges of camaraderie. Yet the hours turned darker, and what happened in the spaces between is something only a handful of men knew, men who would later sit in courtrooms with faces frozen by secrecy. Surveillance cameras captured flickers of the night's truth. A car pulling from the driveway of Hernandez's mansion, its taillights glowing like embers in the dark. The police found Odin's body with shell casings nearby, each one a cold clue left behind like punctuation to an unfinished sentence. He had been shot multiple times, execution style, and left in the open as though abandoned by the very bonds that had once held him close. At first, the possibility seemed unthinkable. Aaron Hernandez, the Patriots' star, implicated in murder. Yet the trail grew clearer, with every frame of footage, every ping of a cell phone tower, every breadcrumb Hernandez seemed unable or unwilling to conceal. Back at the mansion, cameras showed him returning home that night, a gun clutched in his hand, his steps brisk and unshaken. Friends who had been with him stumbled awkwardly through their stories, aligning and misaligning with the evidence until silence became its own testimony. Detectives arrived at his estate, a place of manicured lawns and grand halls, but the air inside felt unsettled, like a stage hastily cleared before the curtain rose. They found shattered cell phones, destroyed intentionally, as though to erase the voices they once carried. They discovered a surveillance system, wiped of key moments, gaps in time, as telling as any recording. In the garage, rental cars carried the faint smell of gunpowder. The weight of suspicion was undeniable. Reporters descended like vultures, their cameras pressing against iron gates, their headlines already forming before the ink of the warrants had dried. A man who once stood on the field with Tom Brady was now handcuffed, led from his home in a white t-shirt, his expression caught between defiance and detachment. The world watched as cheers turned into gasps. The murder of Odin Lloyd was not merely a crime, it was a collapse. The symmetry of fame and downfall converged in a single moment, the image of a football star, tattooed arms behind his back, escorted past the press. Fans who once wore his jersey now tore it from their closets, uneasy with the thought that every touchdown they celebrated had been shadowed by violence. The industrial park remained quiet after the body was removed, the gravel holding only the memory of footsteps that ended too soon. Yet the echoes stretched far beyond that patch of ground. In the courtroom that would soon follow, those echoes would become evidence, testimony, theater. But here, on that summer night, they were only questions, pressing against the dark sky without answer. A clock ticks differently in such moments, not forward, but in fragments, each second dragging the past into the present. And with Odin Lloyd's death, the countdown toward Aaron Hernandez's unraveling had begun in earnest. The courtroom filled like a theater, every seat occupied by faces eager to witness the spectacle. Cameras clicked, pens scratched, and the air thickened with a tension that belonged as much to drama as to justice. At the center of it sat Aaron Hernandez, no longer the star framed by stadium lights, but the defendant framed by wood and steel, his broad shoulders draped in a suit that could not soften the shackles of his reality. The prosecution painted a portrait of arrogance and inevitability, a man who believed himself untouchable, whose fame and fortune had cocooned him in a sense of invincibility. They laid out the pieces like a grim puzzle: surveillance footage, bullet casings, text messages to Odin Lloyd that read like preludes to betrayal. Each detail was another crack in the myth of the untouchable athlete. But Hernandez's defense countered with equal theater. They pointed to gaps in timelines, inconsistencies in testimonies, shadows of doubt left by the very men who had been with him that night. These were not credible witnesses, they argued, but men grasping for survival in a world of shifting loyalties. The contradictions were sharp enough to slice the narrative in two. Spectators leaned forward with every flicker of his expression. Hernandez sat mostly still, but when he smiled at a joke whispered by his attorney, or at the sight of his fiancée and daughter in the gallery, the courtroom rippled with unease. Was it defiance? Was it bravado? Or was it the last remnants of a man who still believed in his own myth? Tattoos across his body became points of fascination, as though ink could confess where words refused. Prosecutors suggested they bore coded meaning, references to violence, to loyalty, to unspoken ties. The skin that once bore the glory of a football warrior was now examined under the fluorescent light of suspicion, each line of ink a potential confession. Outside, the media swarmed like moths circling flame. Headlines blurred fact and insinuation. Gangster or gridiron hero, tattoo clues in murder trial. Television trucks hummed outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes pointed skyward as if searching for answers the law itself could not provide. Inside, witnesses faltered, memories fractured under cross-examination. Some details fit too neatly, others unraveled like threads pulled from a frayed shirt. It was a performance of truth and lies, stitched together with the fragile needle of persuasion. Yet the atmosphere was more than legal, it was tragic. Each glimpse of his fiancée holding their daughter reminded the gallery of what lay at stake beyond verdicts. A child growing up with whispers instead of memories. A family broken not by accident but by choices still obscured. The judge's gavel struck with a sound like a gunshot, echoing through the chamber. In that moment, the courtroom ceased to be about evidence alone. It became a mirror held to society's obsession with fame, violence, and downfall. And still, amid the evidence and spectacle, one question lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Was Aaron Hernandez a murderer hiding in plain sight, or a man caught in the machinery of suspicion, punished not only for his crime but for the contradictions of his very existence? The trial was not simply a reckoning. It was theater, a performance in which the line between justice and spectacle blurred until it was nearly indistinguishable. The prison letters arrived like fragments of a soul pressed into paper. Each envelope carried the cramped handwriting of Aaron Hernandez, the loops and slants betraying urgency, sometimes tenderness, sometimes rage. In one letter to his fiancée, Cheyenne, he wrote of love, of promises that seemed impossible to keep from behind the bars. In another, he spoke of betrayal, of friends who had turned cold, of loyalty eroded by whispers and deals. It was as if Hernandez had split into two men. One wrote to his daughter, drawing hearts beside words of affection, promising that he was always near, even when walls divided them. Another wrote in a harder voice, one that sounded more like the streets he came from, clipped, coded, hinting at debts and dangers he could never fully escape. Prison, for Hernandez, was not only confinement but reflection, a mirror turned inward. Without the roars of the stadium or the armor of teammates, he faced himself in silence. In that silence, the contradictions sharpened. He was a young father longing for his child's laughter, and a man who could not sever the threads of violence woven through his life. Other inmates watched him with a mixture of awe and wariness. To some, he was still the NFL star, the celebrity in their midst. To others, he was simply another man, wearing state-issued gray, stripped of privilege, left to navigate alliances and threats that lurked in prison corridors. His size and reputation offered protection. But protection is never permanent inside concrete walls. At night, in his cell, the world narrowed to the sound of his own breathing, the scrape of shoes along the corridor, the ticking of time measured not by clocks, but by the distant clang of doors. Hernandez kept photos taped to the wall, his daughter smiling, her face lit by innocence, untouched by scandal. That smile was both an anchor and a weight, reminding him of what he had lost, what he had endangered, and perhaps what he still hoped to reclaim. The letters reveal flashes of faith. He quoted scripture, clung to passages about redemption and endurance, as if trying to knit a new self from words older than his mistakes. Yet faith and doubt wrestled on the page, each line contradicting the last. He wrote of hope for appeals, of lawyers who promised a way out, but also of sleepless nights haunted by the possibility that this cell was the final chapter. In one letter, he drew a simple image, a clock with no hands, a symbol of timelessness or of time already run out. It was as if he felt suspended between futures that could never arrive. Observers of those letters argued over what they revealed. To some, they were proof of a man seeking redemption, fighting for light in a place built for shadow. To others, they exposed the turbulence of a man who could never reconcile the two lives he lived, the boy from Bristol who ran from grief, and the star who could never outrun it. Every word he wrote was both confession and disguise, each page a reminder that truth is often split in two, just like the man himself. When doctors opened Aaron Hernandez's skull for autopsy, they uncovered a landscape scarred by invisible storms. His brain, just 27 years old, showed the hallmarks of chronic traumatic encephalopathy (CTE), a disease most often seen in men decades older. The tissue bore the signature of repeated blows, tau protein deposits, neural decay, the silent wreckage of years colliding headfirst into destiny on the football field. The revelation fell across the public like a shadow. For years, the NFL had been accused of minimizing the toll of its violence, downplaying the link between head trauma and mental collapse. Now, in Hernandez, they had a tragic example. A young man, physically prime, yet carrying the neurological scars of a soldier who had fought too many wars. Doctors spoke clinically. Stage 3 CTE, severe damage to the frontal lobe seat of judgment, impulse control, decision-making, the very region that tempers rage, that restrains violence, that whispers caution before action. In Hernandez, those fibers were frayed, nearly shredded. The brain scans glowed with eerie blotches, like shadows on X-rays, maps of a mind unraveling. His lawyers seized on the findings as explanation, even vindication. Here was a man whose violence was not entirely his own, but the result of a game that glorified brutality while denying its costs. His defenders asked, how much of Aaron Hernandez's story was his choice, and how much was the slow sabotage of a sport that rewarded him for hits that stole pieces of his mind? But others rejected such absolution. CTE could not explain every decision, every pull of a trigger, every destruction of evidence. Science illuminated part of the labyrinth, but not all of it. To lean too heavily on diagnosis was to risk erasing agency, to dismiss the lives shattered beyond Hernandez's own. Still, the images of his brain lingered cross-sections like broken clocks, neurons frayed like wires sparking in the dark. It became a motif for his life, a body trained for violence, a mind undone by it. The symmetry was too haunting to ignore. There is a cruel irony in CTE. It often reveals itself only after death. The men who carry its weight rarely know it, though their families see the signs: mood swings, paranoia, memory loss, sudden eruptions of anger. For Cheyenne Jenkins, for the daughter who would grow up reading about her father in headlines instead of memories, the science arrived too late to explain the haunted eyes in photographs. In press conferences, doctors held up slides like evidence from a crime scene, pointing to damage that could not be reversed. But outside the laboratories, the story felt less like science and more like fate. Aaron Hernandez had given his body to a game, and in return the game had hollowed him out, piece by piece, until only shadows remained. And so, amid the debates, murderer, victim, or both, the image of his brain persisted, floating like a ghost in the narrative. A brain younger than most, older than it should have been. A clock without hands, ticking only in reverse. The cell door that morning swung open to a silence deeper than sleep. Aaron Hernandez was found hanging by a bedsheet tied to the steel frame of his window. The scene was carefully arranged, almost ceremonial. On his bunk lay a Bible open to John 3:16, the verse of salvation and eternal life. Across his forehead, scrawled faintly in ink, were the same numbers, 3:16. 3 notes had been placed nearby, one to his fiancée, one to his daughter, one to a man still unnamed in public accounts. Just days earlier, Hernandez had celebrated a legal victory. A double homicide case in Boston ended with acquittal. His lawyers were buoyant, speaking of appeals that could overturn his life sentence for Odin Lloyd's murder. Even Massachusetts law offered a strange loophole. With his death, some convictions could be vacated, leaving his record legally cleansed. To those who knew him, there was reason for hope. Why, then, would a man poised on the edge of possible freedom choose death? The contradictions deepened the mystery. His final phone call, hours before his death, had carried no trace of despair. He spoke of love, of the future, even of plans. Guards reported no signs of agitation. To them, Hernandez had seemed calm, almost buoyant. And then, within hours, he was gone. The details unsettled even the most skeptical observers. The Bible, the scripture, the carefully tied knots, each element felt more like a message than a surrender. Some saw symbolism in the placement. Others saw evidence of planning that stretched beyond impulse. The notes, though private, hinted at contradictions, professions of eternal presence, lines that blurred between farewell and reassurance. Rumors swirled quickly in the vacuum of certainty. Had Hernandez chosen death as a final act of control, a way to secure financial stability for his daughter through vacated convictions? Was it despair masked as serenity? Or had unseen pressures, debts, threats, secrets, cornered him into a decision that bore the fingerprints of others? Inside the prison, whispers suggested conflicts, dangerous affiliations, debts unpaid. Some inmates hinted at silences enforced by violence, at codes older than any courtroom. Outside, commentators debated psychology, theology, and law, as though the meaning of his death could be settled in panels and headlines. But the reality remained fixed in the cold geometry of the cell. A body swaying gently in the half-light, a Bible waiting with its verses of salvation, and the echo of a final breath that left behind more questions than it answered. It is said that prisons measure time differently, in slow drips and echoes rather than minutes. On that morning, time itself seemed to halt in the narrow space of his cell. The clock on the corridor wall recorded the hour, but the moment belonged not to time, only to silence, the kind of silence that hums with unfinished stories. Aaron Hernandez had died, but his story had not ended. In truth, it had only fractured further, scattering into contradictions that would never be reconciled. In the weeks after his death, the silence was quickly filled with noise, rumors, speculations, whispered confessions that blurred truth with myth. Hernandez, once a man of flesh and contradictions, became a vessel for projections. Every tattoo on his skin, every word from his letters, every coded glance in old footage was dissected as if it carried the key to understanding what could never be fully known. Some spoke of gang ties that shadowed him from Bristol to the NFL. Old friends from his neighborhood claimed he had never truly escaped the orbit of violence, that success only masked the pull of loyalties forged in adolescence. Others suggested darker secrets, that Hernandez had lived with a concealed part of himself, that hidden struggles with his sexuality had made him vulnerable to ridicule, blackmail, or inner torment. A former teammate spoke cautiously, hinting at a private life cordoned off behind walls of fear. The tattoos across his body became hieroglyphs. Analysts and law enforcement speculated about their meanings, symbols tied to shootings, cryptic initials, reminders of allegiances no courtroom could name aloud. His arms, once celebrated for touchdowns, were now studied as a map of confession, as though ink could bridge the gap between silence and revelation. The Bible verse John 3:16 scrawled onto his skin at the time of his death only added to the enigma. Was it an act of faith, a message of resurrection, or something coded beyond Scripture? To some, it was proof of rebirth. To others, it was a sign of despair so profound it could only find voice in ancient text. In Bristol, neighbors remembered a boy running the length of backyards, too fast to be caught, too bright to be ignored. In Foxborough, fans remembered touchdowns that split defenses like lightning across a storm. And in prison, fellow inmates remembered a man who oscillated between warmth and menace, who seemed as likely to share a smile as he was to retreat into silence. Each memory painted a different man. Each truth contradicted the next. And so, conspiracies multiplied. Some whispered that his death was not suicide at all, but punishment from forces inside the prison, or silencing by hands unseen. Others clung to the theory that his final act was deliberate strategy to clear his conviction, to secure a legacy for his daughter, to leave behind a paradox rather than defeat. What remains is not certainty but fragments. Rumors about sexuality never spoken aloud while he lived. Codes etched in tattoos that only he could truly translate. A Bible verse drawn like a final riddle. Together they form a mosaic of contradictions, impossible to assemble into a single truth. Perhaps that is the legacy of Aaron Hernandez, not only the fall of a star, but the way his story refuses to end, even in death. In mirrors, in ink, in whispers of secrets too heavy to carry, he lingers, half myth and half man, unresolved. The echoes did not fade when the prison gates closed behind his coffin. They spread outward into living rooms where his games once played on Sunday afternoons, into classrooms where his name became shorthand for cautionary tales, into courtrooms where lawyers still argued about justice and tragedy. Aaron Hernandez was gone, yet he remained everywhere, a ghost woven into the fabric of sport and scandal alike. At Gillette Stadium, his name was erased swiftly, as though deletion could cleanse memory. Jerseys were pulled from shelves, banners discarded, the Patriots' dynasty moving forward without mention. But for fans, silence was never enough. Some clung to the memory of his touchdowns, unwilling to reconcile the player with the prisoner. Others saw only betrayal, a hero unmasked as a killer. The stadium roared on, but in its echoes lingered a reminder. Glory is fragile, and idols can fall faster than they rise. In Bristol, the town that had once watched him sprint under Friday night lights, people spoke of him in softer tones. To them he was still a son, a boy who once darted through yards with the weight of grief already shadowing him. Murals appeared quietly, painted in hidden corners, not tributes, but elegies, attempts to reconcile the boy they remembered with the man they could not understand. His daughter, too young to recall his voice except through recordings, would grow up with a fractured inheritance. A father remembered in highlight reels and court transcripts, in lullabies, sung through prison phones, and in headlines that could never decide whether he was villain, victim, or both. For her, the truth would never be singular. It would be a mirror reflecting contradictions, each angle showing a different face. The debate over his brain continued in laboratories, scientists tracing the damage with precise instruments, holding his story aloft as evidence of a game that demanded violence and denied its costs. His name entered medical journals, not as a player, but as a case study, a caution whispered in clinical terms. To researchers, Hernandez was a symptom of something larger, an entire sport haunted by the brains it had broken. And yet, even science could not close the story. For every chart that explained, another contradiction arose. Was CTE enough to explain rage, betrayal, murder? Was Hernandez merely a victim of biology and brutality? Or did choice and circumstance weave tighter around him than any disease? In the end, his story remains a parable without conclusion. A boy who ran faster than grief, a man who soared higher than expectation, and who fell further than most can fathom. A life of touchdowns and tattoos, of stadium lights and prison shadows, of love letters and final notes. Perhaps the true tragedy lies not in what we know, but in what we never will. The locked room of his mind remains closed forever, its secrets buried with him. All that remains are echoes, the sound of cheers swallowed by silence, the ticking of clocks that cannot rewind, and the haunting truth that some stories do not end, they only linger.